everyone. Welcome back to Needed Conversations. Today is going to be a very special day because we have an incredible interview with some special guests, and the conversation is going to be spicy.
Yes, we have very special guests, Tony and Alisa DiLorenzo from the One Extraordinary Marriage organization, and they've written a book. It's called The 6 Pillars of Intimacy, and we're excited to interview them. We do want to give a disclaimer today. We do talk a lot about I wouldn't say rated R, but pretty close. We're talking about sex. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about the 6 pillars of intimacy. It deals with a lot. But we definitely talk about sex. And so if you have kids around, you may want to listen to this a little bit later. But this is a breakthrough conversation. It's certainly a needed conversation. But before we jump into the interview, we want to encourage you to go to moremostforever.com and sign up to be a part of our intentional marriage community. How do you do that? You become a partner with our ministry for any amount, $5 or more per month. And so you click that little banner on our website, and what you'll get as a thank you is access to our online portal where you create a username, you get access to courses and resources. We do a weekly devotional, a monthly date idea, along with a group session once a month. So many things. And also we're hosting our in-person gathering, the first one of this year, March the 3rd. So if you're listening to this after that, it's already done. I'm sure there's other events, but March the 3rd, it's the Intentional Marriage Date Night in the upstate of South Carolina. So all of that is at moremostforever.com. You can find out about our event. You can find out about our intentional marriage group and so much more. Well, without further ado, they've been married for 27 years. They've come through a lot. A stagnant marriage. Tony overcame a pornography addiction. We're going to get into that. They had almost like a sexless marriage at one point, from what I understand. And now they have a vibrant, thriving marriage, and they've been coaching couples now in their 6 pillars of intimacy. So let's jump right into this conversation with Tony and Alisa DiLorenzo. Well, we are so glad to have you, especially this month. It's February, Love Month, and all
Yeah.
month long, we have been talking about passion. And
Okay.
so we've been breaking down, what is passion? How do you cultivate it? Is it strictly external, or is it more in our power than we think it is? And one of the key scriptures we've been looking at is the one where it says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And
Okay.
we know that it's not him giving everything that we want to us. It's him actually depositing the desires that he wants us to have as we delight in him. And we've been paralleling that to marriage. And how do
Okay.
you reignite that passion and flame that's been burnt out? Well, you've got to intentionally delight in your spouse. And we've been talking about what that means. And I think it's just the perfect timing to have you guys on, because you guys have become the master of intimacy. And you've
Yes.
written an extraordinary book called The 6 Pillars of Intimacy, which is really a handbook for married couples to give
Yeah.
them the foundation that they need to build a really strong and thriving marriage. I want to start off the podcast by learning a little bit about you, and then we're going to jump into the pillars of intimacy, and we're going to talk about sex today. It's going to be
Yeah.
exciting. But tell us a little bit about your love story, how you met, and how you ended up in marriage ministry.
Yeah. So Elisa and I met in 1994 at the University of Colorado Boulder. I had just turned 21. Elisa was 19. I was a cook and a hasher at my fraternity house for the summer, which we rented out our house to a minority student program. And so Elisa was one of the students. I was living at the house for free room and board, basically, and then I got paid because I was a breakfast cook. And this was the second year we had done it. The first year, the guys that were in the house, we just sort of did our own thing. We stayed away from all the other students. And prior to this summer program starting, they're like, "Hey, guys, like it felt awkward. Like you just did your thing and didn't talk to anybody. So this year, could you just like meet the students, hang out with them?" Well,
He did a really good job, because here we are 30 years later. He did a great job hanging out with this particular intern.
Yep. And so Lisa and I met in 94. We ended up getting married in 96. Been married 27 years now. And we have a 21 and an 18-year-old. We live here in San Diego and have for some time now.
So you guys don't look old enough to have kids that age.
Oh, well, thank you. I receive all of that.
Yeah.
That's a blessing. I would like to say they keep us young, but then I'll probably walk into my kitchen and it'll be a disaster area. So,
Yeah, we have 2 kids as well. So when we see other people have made it with 2 and they're grown adults now, we know that we can be successful as well. So
Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely. There's a big journey of that. And in talking about the children, we started One Extraordinary Marriage in 2010. That's when the podcast started. We've been doing a weekly podcast episode every week since. And so our children were young. They were
4 and 7 when we started. But, really, you asked the question about marriage ministry, and that came about because our marriage was so dysfunctional. We really found ourselves at a crossroads the year prior to that when the kids were, 3 and 6 of, wondering what the future held for our marriage. And our kids were little. We were really, I think, just almost depressed. I mean, it was just kind of a really sad place to be in. We were living more like roommates than lovers. We were going through the motions. We were decent at handling the logistics of married life, but, weren't really connecting on any level. And actually found ourselves contemplating divorce and going, you know what, now, or do I wait until the kids grow up and go off to college? And, we're in this really weird season right now because our baby, who was 2 going on 3 at that point in time, she's about to graduate from high school. And there are a lot of people that wait until their youngest graduates from high school and then they get the divorce that they've been sitting on for all the years. And we're right at that point, but we made the decision to get radical and go after having an extraordinary marriage.
that's awesome. I read in your book, I don't know if that jump started your healing journey, but I think you guys had the 60-day sex challenge.
So tell us about, I heard, I don't know if it was you, Tony, that saw a show and where some wife gifted her husband a year of sex and that inspired you. Tell us about that.
Inspiration.
Yeah. And the reason that inspired me is Elisa and I were about to lead a small group study at our church on the Song of Solomon. And it was going to be an 8-week study because I felt like, and this is now we're going back 16 years now. And so we're making progress in the church. We're starting to talk about sexual intimacy more. 16 years ago, it really wasn't talked about at all. I mean, maybe if you got to a marriage getaway, they might have a session, but it really wasn't. And so I actually was just like, we need to talk about this, Elisa. And so we're watching some evening news segment and these 2 couples show up. One is the wife gifted her husband for a year, 365 days of sex. They never say how many days they ended up having sexual intercourse, but that's what she gifted him. And then another couple had done 101 days in a row. Straight. Like they made it straight. And in my head, and I'm a dreamer and a visionary, and I'm like I'm thinking, okay, we got an 8-week study coming up, sort of like built-in accountability with some folks and some couples, and we could laugh and have fun. And I'm like, man, that's 60 days. And I remember just looking at Elisa going like, let's do a 60-day sex challenge.
And I said no. Very quickly, very abruptly. And to put an exclamation point on it, I immediately got up out of bed, went and put on a facial mask, and then just sat in bed with my arms crossed. Like nothing's happening tonight either. So shoot that idea. But, a big part of our story is I had a come to Jesus moment. The next day I was standing in our garage with a basket full of laundry and heard the voice of God say, "Are you really not willing to try?" And I was like, no, we're not having this conversation. Like, all those moments where somebody wrestles with God, I'm like, no, we're not having this conversation. I don't want to do this. This is not the answer. And the next response was, he's not asking you to do anything else but make the marriage a priority. And can't really argue with that. When it's the voice of God, you can't argue. And so Tony came home from work that day and I said, you know what, I'm in. Let's do this. And long story short, we ended up completing 40 out of 60 days.
Yep.
That's so great. I'm sure you had to get very creative after the first week.
Yeah, you get creative, but you know what? it was so much more than the sexual intimacy. And that's what we
Good.
share so much with folks now. Everybody typically just goes, oh, it was just, you just had a bunch of sex. And yes, we did, but we really begin to strengthen that emotional intimacy. We really begin to strengthen that spiritual intimacy. There are other areas in our marriage that were just so depleted. And it's what you were saying to start off the episode, the passion. Like, where did the passion go? We didn't have excitement in our marriage anymore. It was just sort of like the same old. And by putting this in there at a time when our children were 5 and 2 and 11 years married, it brought back that passion and that romance and that desire for one another that I don't think that I had felt for many, many years. And there are still many moments that happened in those 60 days that I still remember to this day that were like, wow, I can't believe we did that, but we did. And so that's really just started that fire again, like you had said.
Yeah. When we're counseling couples, we find that most of the time they're just scratching the surface of sex, right? And they're out here trying to live out some Hollywood fantasy, or they're still got pornography in the back of their mind. And I love what you guys break down with the 6 pillars of intimacy, because it forces you to dig deep, which is probably what that challenge does too. Because after the first 7 days, probably you've done everything that you've known to do in your whole marriage. And you're like, man, sex has got to be more than just the physical. And what we've discovered is the more you start pulling at the threads of emotional connection and sharing a common vision and those sorts of things, is that sex becomes even better. Is that kind of what inspired the 6 pillars of intimacy? And talk about how did you come about this book?
So, I mean, a lot of what you're saying are all the different components. I mean, what we found was that the sexual intimacy was the catalyst, right? We made a commitment to one another that we were going to have sex, for 60 days. We had agreed that we weren't going to do it. If somebody was sick, if somebody was out of town, or if I was on my period. Those were like the 3, just here's where you get a pass. But what we found is we started talking more. We were having the conversations. We started touching one another more. Physical touch came back into our marriage. I remember distinctly, sitting there in the minivan, because you got the 2 little kids, and, 12, 14 years ago, you had the minivan. And I remember looking over at Tony. I can tell you exactly where we were in San Diego, and thinking, I like him. And it had been such a long time since I had actually just felt like I liked my husband. And so we started rediscovering that there were things that we like to do together and spend time together. And so out of that awareness is where we started exploring the idea that intimacy isn't just sex, even though that often gets, associated in our society. It's all about the closeness and connection. And since we can't be having sex 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in our marriages, how do we cultivate closeness and connection in every area to have an extraordinary marriage?
Yeah, I was listening to a clip of a pastor that was teaching, and it was so profound what he said. He said men need to have sex in order to feel connected, and women need to be connected in order to have sex. And I thought that was profound because, like you said, you struggled with feeling like, I can't be touchy-feely, I'm busy, I'm always kind of disregarding him. But I think if you have a different perception of what sex really means to him, it's really a connection. It's how he feels connected, like nonverbal communication. Do you feel like that's the case for both men and women? Do you feel like that statement is true?
I would say not in 100% of the cases, because we do have a lot of wives over the last 14 years that we've had our podcast, and women that I've coached reach out and say, you know what, I have this deep need for sexual intimacy, and my husband doesn't. And there are men who are like, if my wife would just talk to me, that would be amazing. So we see it both ways, but generally there is one spouse that really needs that sexual intimacy to feel connected, and one spouse that deeply needs the emotional intimacy to feel connected. And that's why those 2 pillars in the book anchor the 6 pillars of intimacy, because they're so vitally important to going, we need both. You can't just have a marriage that's all emotional and no sexual, or all sexual and no emotional.
Yeah, for sure.
So you hit on something important there. Those are 2 foundational pillars, correct?
Yes.
Let's dig into the emotional pillar. And in particular, I know every couple's different, like you said, But of course, a lot of times men, it's hard for them to open up, or,
Yep.
statistically speaking, men use far fewer words than women do. So
Yeah.
if you were to give advice to a wife listening who says, I just can't get my husband to connect emotionally or open up, and how do I break that shell and get to the heart of
Mm.
my husband? What would you say to her?
First of all, think baby steps.
Yeah.
That's first. Two, any of the intimacies are simply a matter of developing skills. We talk about it being
Yeah.
skill development. You can say I'm not a talker, but you know what? Most of the people that have said I'm not a talker can definitely have a conversation if it's something they're passionate about or something they're interested in. And start with tools, right? A lot of times we talk about, conversation cards or conversation starters, because this way there isn't the pressure of, oh my gosh, what do I ask you? I don't know what to ask you. It's like, hey, so here's what this card says. Let's have a conversation about it. Right. And even keeping those conversations short, because a lot of people that would say, I'm not a talker, think that if their spouse says, I want to talk to you, it's going to be a 3 hour long conversation
Yeah.
and they've got, enough words for 10 minutes. So even bringing it back down and saying, hey, let's just set a timer for 10 minutes and ask and answer a question. And then you go do what you want to do. And I'm going to go do what I want to do. We're actually going to kiss and we're going to say, that was great. And building in the rewards, having a short time helps that spouse that doesn't feel like they're going to be able to handle it to go, I can do this.
Yeah. And I would say change up the environment.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times we get stuck in our same places. Like we need to talk here. And if that's something that's been happening in the marriage, and it might be time to just go, all right, we're going to change this whole thing up. And something that Elisa and I started many years ago, we call it our walk and talks. And so instead of sitting across from one another and we're going to have this deep conversation and, we're going to be knee to knee and I'm holding her hands and she's holding mine and we're looking deep into each other's eyes. It's sort of like, let's get up, let's go put on some tennis shoes and let's just go side by side like we are, all of us are right now. We're side by side and let's just hold each other's hands and let's just go for a walk. And let's just talk about something. If a conversation card helps or something, some conversation starter question or whatever it may be, use it. But it begins to it for guys, I think it allows the movement to happen. And I think sometimes guys need to get out instead of being caged in and stuck in like, I got to talk in this, only in this area. We know couples in the one family who've done different things like, hey, they go for a drive and dive. So they pick up a shake.
Cold weather.
Right. They pick up a shake and they just go for a drive. But again, it's movement. They're shoulder to shoulder instead of across from one another. And I found for myself and for many of husbands that I've talked to over the years, it's really allowed them to just feel a little bit more at ease. And instead of being against their spouse, they're on the same team with them.
Mm. That's so good. I love that. I was thinking while you were talking about the physical intimacy. What
Okay.
happens when one of the spouses has weaponized sex? Maybe use it as a form of punishment to get even or withholding. What would you say to a couple like that, and how detrimental that is? You know?
Well, first, let me actually separate physical intimacy and sexual intimacy because when
Oh,
we talk
okay.
about the six pillars, we actually broke them apart because so many people early on, when we had started the podcast and whatnot, would talk about wanting more physical intimacy, which is most often associated when people say that with sex. But people also crave that non-sexual touch, the hugs, the
Mhm.
kisses, I want you to like put your hand on my leg, or I want to hold hands with you when we're
The
walking.
cuddles.
So we actually, when I was writing the book, I pulled that apart. So physical intimacy is going to be your non-sexual touch. So it sounds like what you're talking more about is the sexual intimacy.
Oh,
What happens when
yes.
sex has been weaponized.
Yeah.
Right.
And most often sex is weaponized when there are deep hurts in a marriage that haven't been resolved.
Mm.
Right. And so sex becomes something that is control about you've hurt me and I don't know how to verbalize it or we haven't had resolution on it. So I'm going to withhold, coming back to Victoria, like you were saying earlier, so many men specifically need that sexual intimacy to feel connected. So if I don't feel connected to you emotionally, I'm going to withhold the thing that matters most to you. And this is where a couple really, if they have not been able to resolve this on their own, I always recommend professional help
Mhm.
because that wound can get really deep and infected just because of the behaviors there. Instead saying, let's bring in a professional who can hear both sides, who can be that bridge, who can facilitate healing so that we aren't using what God actually intended as a tool to bring us closer together and being in that place
Mm.
where we're pulling sex from one another.
Yeah, the weaponization of sex usually is there's a root issue, right? And so we need to get to that root issue. And for a number of folks, it happens due to rape, molestation, whatever it may be at a young age. They're still holding on to it. And so we got to deal with the trauma and we need professionals. So Elise and I know who we serve, how we serve our couples best. So whenever we have couples who are in that, and she even hears it sometimes in her coaching, it's like, all right, we need to get you with a trauma
Mhm.
specialist, counselor, therapist, whoever it is, so that you can really dig into that root issue
If
and
that has
address
been,
it.
yeah, if that's
And if that's
happened.
been, if
It's
that's
not always trauma. Sometimes it's just a lot of anger and
that's
resentment,
true too.
and unforgiveness, bitterness,
Mhm.
because you haven't addressed the issues and you don't have the emotional intimacy. You aren't working on the emotional intimacy to talk about those things.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to separate both the physical and the sexual. I think it's because when we don't communicate in marriage, we think if, God forbid, he touches me, it's like it equals sex. And so I also think that's how society kind of plays it out to be. Like if there's a hug, then it actually equals sex. And that's not necessarily true. And it's so important for us to communicate. I remember seeing somebody actually said that on a video, like they wrote a note to a wife and that it said non-sexual massage that I'm going to give you in the evening so that she's like not paranoid, especially for moms, young moms that have children. And I know the husband wants to be connected and it's not necessarily that he wants just the sex. I think he also wants just the physical presence of another human being. And maybe that's the only way that he feels connected is that whenever we're actually touching and, having sex. And so I think a lot of women in their mind kind of put this misconception. And I think it's so important for us to separate those things and also communicate. I think we need those points of contact. I think that's something we teach too. Like I know it's important for us to have those points of contact throughout the day so that that person doesn't feel disconnected and even be intentional about scheduling sex. I think some people are um they say things like it's not going to be spontaneous, but I mean, you guys did a whole 60-day challenge. Yeah, I mean, most people can't even schedule something once a week, but
And yeah, you do have to be creative. But to your point, and if I can just address the spontaneous aspect of scheduling sex, it, yeah, this does not mean necessarily that you're scheduling like Tuesday at 9:07 p.m. I'll meet you for 3 minutes. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about scheduling sex. It's about looking at your week or your month and saying, when are we focused on our sexual intimacy? What are the days
Mhm.
that are go days? For lack of a better phrase. And then how are we going to initiate? Because initiating's got all kinds of spontaneity in it. You've got all kinds of options when it comes to foreplay. You've got options when it comes to positions. So you can build out this incredible spontaneous sexual experience. You just know when it's going to happen.
yeah.
And like Tony says at the top of every episode that we do, we're scheduling sex takes the guesswork out of knowing when you're going to get some. Because if we can eliminate that question, we actually eliminate a lot of the tension between
Mm.
husband, no matter what the ages of your kids are.
Yeah. And we've been living out what we call our intimacy lifestyle, which is scheduling sex for the last 14, 15 years.
Mhm.
And so we've done that for many, many years, since our kids were young to where they are now.
Yeah.
Wow. So I know that it's hard for some of the listeners to understand what I'm about to say, but we have talked with people and have heard stories as well where couples have gone, and this is primarily in on the woman's side of things, but I'm sure it could have. Well, I guess it would be mainly the woman who they've been married for years, even had children, and the woman has never experienced an orgasm before.
Mhm.
Um, I believe that women are more in control of orgasm than they believe that they are,
Mhm.
because I think you could think yourself there even. But I definitely think it requires a lot of communication, and I have my thoughts about it. But I want to hear what you have to say about it, and how can we get a person to that place of experiencing pleasure. But not only that, sometimes it's hit or miss for people. Like
Sure.
they have an orgasm a couple times a year, but every other sexual encounter, it doesn't reach that. And then what if they could have more than one? Right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we get to that point? So I know that's a loaded question, but go ahead.
Well, let,
I'm
let,
trying to,
let
but
me, well, I was just going to preface it. Let me start by saying I'm a wife who probably for the first decade of our marriage, it
yeah,
was totally hit or miss.
Mm,
Like maybe, maybe not. The last 17 years, pretty consistently, almost always. And a big part of that was, some of the things you mentioned. Tony and I started actually talking about our sex life, right? It's amazing. If you don't talk about it, it's kind of hard to know what's working and what's not working, whether it's in the moment or, outside of the bedroom.
mhm.
We started to, because we were so focused for that season on our sexual intimacy, like and we didn't want to do the same thing every day for 60 days. Like we started exploring different positions and using toys and, being in a different room and all of these different types of things.
Lubes and all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. That can bring a different level. And I 100% agree with you. I do think there's a lot that goes on in a woman's head. And, Tony alluded to it earlier, or mentioned it earlier. If you've had sexual trauma of any type, it doesn't have to be rape, it doesn't have to be molestation. Maybe you were just in a really bad relationship
True.
and things went a little too far and you're carrying shame or guilt.
Mhm.
Maybe it's the messages that you received,
mm.
about what sex should be like, right? Growing up, because I grew up in the church and there was a lot of don't do that, good girls don't do that, sex is only for making babies, all those types of messages.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden you get married and like a girlfriend was telling me yesterday, she's like, you go from, don't do it to you should be a freak in the sheets was the phrase that she used, which I thought was hysterical. But when you've got all that messaging or the trauma or the bad experiences, to flip that and say, here I am in this relationship where I have committed before God and my spouse and family and friends that this is my one and only. And now let me just let go of all that. It takes time, but it also takes a willingness on the part of both spouses to want to explore. What does that look like? What could we do? What are the options available to us to explore our bodies and to be in a place where we are building our sexual intimacy?
Yeah, I think the exploration is the big part.
Mhm.
Really, it is. And for so many years, we didn't do that.
Mm-mm.
And once we began to go, okay, what can we learn about one another?
Mm.
How do we learn about it? And instead of just jumping in between the sheets, in bed, lights off, have sex, 2-3 minutes, we're done, move on.
Mhm.
Right? When we began to feel comfortable with one another and go, okay, how do I make you orgasm? Like, what is that like, Alisa? I don't know. I'm not a female. I'm a male. I know how my parts work. I know what allows me to ejaculate, but you need to teach me. And there have been times, honestly, too, that I remember in the early days, like Alisa would literally grab my hand and be like, move it here. Like, I don't know where you're rubbing or where you think you're rubbing, but you're not rubbing in the right spot.
It's amazing with 2
Right.
centimeters different. And here's the thing. I would tell ladies don't just suffer in silence, right? If he's not in the right spot, move his hand.
That's
Move it.
right. Speak up.
And husbands, don't be offended if she's moving her hand. It's much better if she gets you exactly where she needs you to be because she moved her hand, then you're just like, okay, is this going to take an hour?
Yeah.
There are 2 great books.
I was going to say 3, but what are the 2 you're going to say?
Okay, well, I was going to say She Comes First.
Yep. Great
Come
book.
As You Are. And what was the one?
Oh, and then I was going to say 2 other books then from those 2 is the
Vagina Bow.
Vagina Bible and the Penis Book.
Wow.
Oh,
And those-
interesting.
Those books literally it changes how you see yourself and who you are and your own penis and your own vagina as well as your spouse. So we always tell folks in the One Family, we're like, read your book for sure, but make sure you read your spouse's book because you learn a whole ton. Like when I read the Vagina Bible, I was blown away. I was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize what it can do and everything about it. And even for myself, just learning about my own penis and what it can do and how it works as well, it helps because I think even for guys, sometimes we can get our own minds. And I've been there before where you can have an erection, then all of a sudden you're going soft. And you play these games and over in your head, but from an orgasm standpoint, help one another.
Mhm.
Talk
That's
about
so
it.
good.
Like If you don't, you're going to be missing the mark.
You know, it's so interesting that you said that, like, to study even each other, because I remember we read a book, I think it's Birth by, like, a Bradley Method or something like that. It was, like, a very old book, but I had both of my kids naturally, like, that was my goal because I am one of 12 and my mom had 12 kids, and I always said, "If my mom can do 12, I can do at least 1." But honestly, me studying that book, because it actually had small things for husbands to read, and I always say that there was no way that we would have been able to do what we did if we were not knowledgeable about the whole process and trusting your own body and what it actually does. Because it's powerful. I mean, the way God created us and the way our bodies are made, it's for restoration, it's for healing. There's that emotional connection. And it's just powerful for us to be able to learn each other, and in that way we know exactly how to support one another. So that's amazing. Thank you guys for sharing those recommendations.
And I think that most of the time people go straight for home base and they miss
Yeah.
all of the other stuff, right?
Yeah.
We
Right.
often refer to a marriage as like the tabernacle, right? There's the outer
Right.
court, the inner court, in the most holy place. And really, a woman's body is set up like that as well. And you
Uh-huh.
can run straight to the most holy place, but you're missing the outer court and the inner court, which qualifies what happens in that most holy place and gets you to that
Absolutely.
place of
That's so good.
power, right? Victoria, do you have another one you want to ask?
Well, no, I actually wrote down from your book about helping your spouse also kind of feel more comfortable and confident is also saying thank you when your spouse touches you in a way that you like, because that helps to create positive cycles in your marriage. I think that's so
Right.
important, even like sometimes just being verbal and say, "Hey, thanks for doing that," or like, "This is what I like." It just, I think, helps the other person say, "Hey, I'm not guessing, but I know
Mhm.
exactly what I'm doing, and I'm a little bit more confident when I go back in to know what pleases my spouse, and so we can kind of please one another."
Hmm.
And because it's a lifetime growing together,
Yeah.
right? And so, I mean, we've been married 27, it'll be 28 years this October. What worked when we were at 22 and 23 and newlyweds,
Oh yeah.
almost 3 decades later where, there've been a few babies and we're a little bit older and hormones, and I remember the postpartum season, and we've had, losses over the like, things change.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so being in this place where the two of you choose, and it's a choice, to talk about your sexual intimacy, to talk about what feels good now, to talk about maybe what doesn't feel good now, and to do it from a place of, this isn't about pointing fingers, it's not about blaming, it's not about anything. It's like, hey, I want you to know me, right?
Mhm.
Intimacy, intimacy, right?
Mhm.
I want you to know where I am right now. It's what's working right now, so that together we can have the most unbelievable experience.
Yeah, and there is that cross in that emotional intimacy, as you were saying, Victoria, and the thank you, and again, emotional intimacy is that verbal, nonverbal communication, and that's happening when we are having sex as well. So the ability to even move in a way, both of you moving your body in a way that is like engaging each other, or moans, or whatever it may be, that brings the two of you closer together, and that's a process of learning one another and what you're doing in your bed together.
Yeah.
Wow. I want to touch on one more pillar before we end our conversation. And to kind of bridge us to that, which I want to touch on spiritual intimacy, which I think is probably the most overlooked in
Yeah.
most marriages. I want to ask you, Tony, because part of your testimony and what I read about you was you overcame, I think it was an 18-year struggle with pornography. Is
Yes,
that
it-
correct?
Mhm.
Yep.
And that's a lot of people's stories. A lot of men, even women can struggle as well, but of
Mhm.
course, it's a lot of men. How did you overcome that? And how was that affecting your intimacy with your wife?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, let's start with how it was affecting it, right? I mean, what I was seeing wasn't real. And so what I was expecting was well beyond what could ever be done by Elisa, right? And so those images as well were taking the place of who Elisa was. So a lot of the times, in those times when we were having sex, I wasn't even looking at Elisa as Elisa. I was thinking of somebody else, right? or having an image of somebody else in my mind, and Alisa was there.
Mm.
And that is not healthy one bit. But when you're in the throes of an addiction or something like that, you really don't see it. I had stopped and tried to stop many a times in those 18 years. There were periods when life would just happen and it was no big deal. But then stress or whatever circumstances of life, I'd find myself back into it. Um, in the beginning of our marriage, Alisa even knew that I was looking at it as well. And there were obviously times in our marriage where it sort of went up and down. And it was 7 years into our marriage that I finally broke that cycle. It was an absolute miracle, truthfully. Um, she was holding our 1 year old at the time, our oldest, and she was in the living room, and we had our office and my office set up in our garage. We lived in a smaller place, and there was a wall in between. And so I was out there and I began to look at porn. And I remember God just speaking to me and saying, "It is finished." And I'm like, "What's finished?" And he was like, "It is finished." And I remember just hearing this. And I literally just shut down my computer and I walked into the living room as Alisa's sitting there with her son. And I said, "Alisa, I have to let you know. I've been looking at pornography again and it's finished. I'm done. Like, I'm done looking at this stuff." And I think there was probably a moment in time for myself and probably Alisa, like, what's going to make this time any different? And I truly believe it was just this touch. It was a touch from God. And she was about to leave um, to go see her folks with Alex. And I said, "If I even look at it, I'm going to call you." And she's gone for about a week. And I'm like, this is a struggle. Like right now, it's like, I've told you, but now there's really no accountability. You're not around. And I happened to look at it, but I said, "I'm going to tell you if I do." And I remember calling her and just hearing the disappointment in her voice. And it was at that moment that it really hit home. Like, is this the kind of life I want to live? Is this the disappointment I want to bring to my marriage every time I look at pornography? Because this is a me problem and I need to address it. And so that's where I was just like, it's done. And I remember just God at that moment in time saying, "It's finished." And at that point in time, it was done. And I literally have not looked at pornography for 20 years.
Mm.
And it was just this moment and it was just like, wow. And so it changed, but I also had to do some work too, because I had to rewire my brain and my mind to see Alisa as my beautiful wife and not see those images anymore.
To view her as an object. And we live in a pornographic culture, which makes things even harder. How do you keep your mind focused when images come, or is there something that you do? You stop and pray? Is there a recipe to it, or is it just,
I changed my focus, and I remember what God has given me, my beautiful wife, Alisa. And I will say that she is my beautiful wife, Alisa. God has given me her. Everything else is substandard and comes secondary. And so I've always begun to look at Alisa as who she is, being beautiful. And God gave her to me and me to her for a reason. And so again, it's just going back and going, okay, God, if this is true and that I believe it is the truth, then I'm going to continue to focus on Alisa being my beautiful wife. In saying that too, because a lot of times when we don't say something, we'll allow the other object or the other thing taking us away to be more beautiful or amazing than what we have right in front of us. And so I continue to work. I believe in mindset and praying and looking and going, okay, she is like waking up. Like when I introduce Alisa, if we're somewhere in she doesn't know somebody, I'll be like, hey, so-and-so, this is my beautiful wife, Alisa. Like, this is who she is. I'm so proud of her.
I've joked I should actually get my name officially changed to my beautiful wife, Alisa, because that is how I am introduced.
Yeah.
That was actually my wife. Her first language was Ukrainian Russian. When we first got married, that was the first phrase she taught me how to say, which was, "This is my beautiful wife, Vita."
I love that.
Yeah, so he can impress my parents when we came back from the honeymoon.
That's awesome.
Well done.
So the last thing I want to touch on is spiritual intimacy, which I've heard both of you say over the course of this interview, how God stopped you, or you heard the voice of God, and we're right there with you. We believe that that is truly the core of a successful marriage, is connecting spiritually. Talk to us about that pillar, and how can couples cultivate more spiritual intimacy?
Well, I will say it's probably one of the ones that we've had to work. But I won't say the hardest. It's been a different effort that comes in your spiritual intimacy, and I think that's because um, as I was raised, your spiritual relationship with God, your relationship with God is yours, right? It's you have
Mm.
this intimate personal relationship with God. And yet when we get married, Genesis is really clear that the two shall become one.
Yeah.
So what do you do with these individual parallel journeys to bring them together? How do you do that? What does it look like to pray together, to do a Bible study together, to do a devotional together, to serve together? And to do so when all of your life the messaging has been, hey, this is all about you,
Yeah.
right? And so choosing to step into this place, it's like I remember the first time that Tony's ever like, we should pray together. And he started to pray. And I don't know why it struck me as funny, but I burst out into like 7-year-old slumber party, girls laughing uncontrollably, hysterical laughter. My husband's trying to pray for the first time. And I just it was not a great start
It wasn't.
to our spiritual intimacy. But learning to pray together, that's a skill. It's awkward and it's uncomfortable if you've never done it before. And you might think you have to say all the right words. You don't have to say the right words. You just have to be willing to be vulnerable
Mhm.
to God and your spouse. Because on the other side of that vulnerability is an intimacy that will actually rival your emotional intimacy or your sexual intimacy, because it is that threefold cord
Mhm.
that's not
Mm.
easily broken when you bring that all together.
And what I would say from a practical standpoint, I think as couples, sometimes we get excited and we overshoot. Like we get excited. We're like, we want to strengthen this pillar. So we're going to do a devotional every night, 7 nights a week. And you have small children. We have older children, but there's still stuff happening in our lives.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to spiritual intimacy and with any of them, I think it's best to go, what can we do?
Mhm.
Like reasonably, what can we do? If we believe that we can pray together for 3 days a week, then let's put it on our calendar and pray 3 days a week. If it's once, it's okay. Maybe we pray once a week and maybe we pick up a devotional once a week, and we're going to do that on these days. I think a lot of times when we look at our spiritual intimacy, we get excited and then we overshoot, and then we get disappointed that we couldn't
Mhm.
continue. So I would rather see a couple do pray once a week for 30 days, and then 60 days, and then 90 days, and then go like, man, we are fired up. Like, let's do 2 days a week now. Right
Go
on.
for the wins.
Yep.
Go for the wins.
I love that.
Would you guys give an encouraging word to a couple that may be struggling, and they may even read your book and think all 6 pillars are not just crack, they're just completely obliterated? And what would you tell this couple? Where should they begin with their spouse? I know every couple struggle is individual, but where should they begin?
Well, first of all, I would say you're not alone,
Right.
because I get the applications, we get the emails daily from couples that say all of our pillars are cracked.
Mm.
And the fact that you're reaching out to acknowledge that means that you still have hope,
That's right.
right? That you're choosing to do something. From there, what I tell couples in coaching sessions and things like that is maybe they've all got cracks in them, but which one's the least cracked? Right? Where do we have some source of strength? Where have you had wins or
Mhm.
successes? Because we build from wins. We don't operate out of a deficit. If we're just like, oh my gosh, everything's bad, then you might as well curl into the fetal position and just give up. But if you're like, okay, you know what, we're pretty good at this recreational intimacy. We can get out and go for a walk. Okay, well, let's build on that. What are you talking about when you go for a walk? Can we have one conversation that might be around, the touches that are meaningful to you? Can we have another conversation talking about the things that you like to, like we build on what a couple is doing to start to restore, and you only focus on one pillar at a time. If you try and focus on all 6 when you think they're all got cracked, you'll just feel overwhelmed. And success doesn't come from overwhelm. Success comes from taking one baby step and then adding a second and then adding a third.
Yeah.
That's so powerful. Well, thank you so much. You spent so much time with us today, and we're
Oh,
very
thank you.
grateful. Tell everybody where they can find you. I know we can go to Amazon and you can get the 6 Pillars of Intimacy. Right? It's
Love that
wonderful.
cover.
But where can we find you online, social media as well?
Yeah, go to oneextraordinarymarriage.com. Right there you'll find everything you need to find the podcast, find the articles that we have, the books, and everything else we do here.
Wonderful.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you guys for joining us for today's episode. We hope this conversation was very insightful and spicy. Be sure to pick up all the recommended books. I know that it will bless your life.
That's right. Make sure you follow us on social media at More Most Forever and get all your marriage resources. Join the intentional marriage community at moremostforever.com. We'll see you next time.